what did she do? She went to the library. That's what I would have done, wouldn't you? No. Her inquiry led her to research the history of thought that inspired the American founders to form a self-governing republic. She understood that. This was at a time when real history was taught in school, real government, real economics. She understood we were a self-governing nation, but what she saw was not going on in that direction. As she began to understand better the times that she was in, she began to share what she found with her friends. And she did, and they did what people do. They formed a study group in downtown San Francisco. They met on Post Street. We have pictures of it today. Big hall full of people, maybe 100 people. Verna sitting on the stage with her hat and her little white gloves, ready to come to the podium. She shared with them her research, which was taking the shape of a complete philosophy of government. And it was no surprise to her, but her work was documenting a distinctly and overtly biblical Christian philosophy of government, which she read in the primary documents that she was researching in the library. It was post-World War II. What was happening at that time? Post-World War II. It was after the New Deal that instituted the WPA, the Works Progress, whatever it was, Association, in which she had worked as a very young woman with idealism. But while she was working for the WPA, thank you, Carrie, she began to notice a change in the character. Pardon me?
It's
Association. Okay, thank you, WPA.
Yeah.
While she was working there, putting names on the dole for men to get help to feed their families, she began to notice a change in character of the people who came to her. This had been 10 years previous. And that was part of what spurred her to do the research that she did, because she saw that as the men came very ashamed to ask for help, hardworking American men who, because of the Great Depression, were no longer able to put food on the table, as they came again 6 months later asking for more, she began to see a change in their character. It became one of entitlement rather than responsibility, and that's something that spurred on. So with that behind her, this is post-World War II. There were many government relief projects at the time that promoted a more centralized and expanding government. Many conservatives were concerned at that time. There was a general sense of alarm and dread among conservatives, Christians, and patriots of creeping socialistic thinking into the policies of the government. So she was not alone. There was a general grassroots concern. She saw that she was documenting a biblical and Christian philosophy of government. The documentation attested to the biblical Christian roots of our American Constitution and contrasted strongly with the socialistic, atheistic philosophy of government that was taking hold in the politics of the day. God had providentially placed her because by this time, after World War II, she was working for the National Association of Manufacturers. She was the Western representative visiting businessmen, industrialists, capitalists, all conservatives for the National Association of Manufacturers. So she made good friends among them and began to share her research with them. And actually several of them, very prominent men whose names you might know today, helped her publish the first volume, The Christian History of the Constitution, Christian Self-Government. So that's Verna's story. Now, while she was doing her research, she began to gather books. Because her ideal was, in order for her research to stand on its own merit, she needed to have the original book that contained the extract that she was putting into her volume, because you know that the chalk book is not her own writing. Verna Hall isn't in it. It's extracts from primary sources that contributed to the philosophy of education. So now comes the divine encounter between Rosalie Slater and Verna Hall. About that time, another young woman, a teacher, was nearing completion of a PhD at Stanford University in education. When she had an opportunity to visit the Soviet Union, her professors were holding up the Soviet model as a model for American education majors at Stanford University. They admired the Soviet model of education. It was very efficient, and they were holding that up as a model to their students. And so they were taking a group of students to the Soviet Union. This was 1959, and what was happening then? The Cold War, Sputnik. So Americans are scared. You know, the Russians got ahead of us. They put the Sputnik up. I was in school. I was in grammar school then, and we had to actually do bomb. What would you call them? Our desks or drills, right? So it was really a scary time. There were backyard bomb shelters being built. The Stanford professors, who were so enamored with Soviet education, took this group, and Rosalie participated. But while in the USSR, she saw beyond the propaganda. She looked at the faces of the people as they went through the villages, these poor villages that were like 1920s, horses and carts, which we saw in Ukraine in the 1990s. And that's what communism does to a culture. She saw the suppression. She saw the desperation of the people in the streets. She saw the fear in their faces. And what they did, which she really kind of knew at the time, is what we even saw in Ukraine, is that they would have these special places to take visitors to show them what they aspired to do. It was not really what they were doing. So all those sleek schools with fully equipped and so forth, probably never saw a student. But that's the way hospitals were in Ukraine. So while the students and professors were being indoctrinated, she noticed the effect of communism on the people. And on her return, guess what she did? She dropped out. Well, she probably did go. Yes, she did. She went back to the library for many, many years. First thing she did was drop out of her doctorate program at Stanford, and she began to pray about what she should do. So she had a friend who lived in San Francisco, and her friend invited her to come visit. So she went to San Francisco to visit, and the friend said, "Come with me to this lecture that I've been attending on Post Street in downtown San Francisco. I think you'll like it." And so she appeared there in Verna Hall's lecture hall and heard Verna present the history, the principles, the ideology of the American Republic. And while she was listening to Verna, she kept going back and kept going back. She began to hear, because she was a teacher, she'd been a supervisor of science in the schools in Hanford and Southern California. She began to hear a philosophy of education. The philosophy of education of early America in the colonies and up to the Revolution. So she began to write the Teaching and Learning America's Christian History, the Principal Approach. And she did that quietly on her own. She'd go to the lecture. She was so inspired. So vivid in her mind was what she had witnessed in the Soviet Union and what the professors were teaching at Stanford. She felt a very strong calling to document what she was hearing from Verna Hall and discerned to be a philosophy of education. A couple years later, she actually met Verna. They talked. They published Teaching and Learning America's Christian History. The same year, they incorporated the Foundation for American Christian Education. It was 1964. They began traveling, speaking to groups of people, families, patriots, anybody. Rosalie told us about sitting in a living room in Smithville, Virginia, with a family of 12 children and teaching them Christian history. They would go anywhere they were asked. Why is the story astounding?
Because it was ordinary people.
It was ordinary people. It was just like us. It was just ordinary. You heard me tell this.
I really haven't. I know you focused on that at the beginning. Okay, this is where that's going to.
Yes, they were ordinary people just like us. They were enlightened by his story, by providential history, and they took a stand against deception.
So how long did Verna Hall do this teaching on Post Street?
Post Street? I don't know how long. I think by 1964 it was over. I think once they incorporated and they put their work into developing the foundation.
Writing the books.
Publishing, yes. They began publishing then. They published T&L. Chalk was published in 1960. T&L was published in 1964. They found the dictionary in an old law library in Indianapolis in 1968 and reprinted it in its facsimile form. Pictures of the actual, I pulled one out for you to look at. We have the actual 1828 dictionary. I pulled it out for you to see.
Wow. But they encouraged other people to start study groups. So
Yes.
at that point in time, there were a lot of study groups going on. They just weren't directly teaching.
Yes, they had precedence that God had given him by the Holy Spirit. Precedence. When you read the T&L book that was written in 1964, Rosalie talks about progressivism. We know it today as Marxism. The Holy Spirit gave them a forward view, and it came from, I'm convinced, their study of history, because the knowledge of the past informs us of the present so that we can see and understand the future. So they taught many people. Marshall Foster, some of you may know Marshall Foster, Ben Gilmore, James Rose, Reed Smith, Catherine Dang, Stephen McDowell, Russ Walton, Paul Jaley, were all taught by Verna and Rosalie. Many schools were started, many ministries were started. I met them in 1977 when we had a little, a very small, very poor Christian school in our church. We just started that year. We didn't know anything. We started an ACE school with the packets because our pastor said we have to have a Christian school, and they said, well, you've been a teacher, you need to get involved. And I had said I'm never going to walk in the classroom again, but because he told me that I had to, so we were in the school. Carrie was in kindergarten. It was bad news, bad. By the end of the year, I looked around and I thought, this is no different from public school. It's just that we have chapel and we can talk about the Bible and we can pray, which was good. We were there, but it was not achieving what Christian education should achieve. And so my pastor sent me to look at a school on the West Coast, which was a very well-developed Christian school. It was not principal project. We didn't know anything about it. And I was enamored by the school. I thought, we can do this in Chesapeake. But I went, the last day we called to say, yeah, we've done it, we're coming home. He said, but did you go to the Foundation for American Christian Education? I have these red books in this dictionary that Lauren Cunningham had given me, and I wanted you to call them. And I thought, oh yeah, you did say that, didn't you? Okay. So I called the foundation, and they said, come down. And so we were, I don't know, an hour and a half maybe outside of San Francisco. So we drove down, we spent the whole day. And in that day, Verna Hall and Rosalie Slater sat in the two chairs, and me on the couch, and the person who was with me, and taught me Christian history, principal approach, by asking questions. They always did it by asking questions. You knew how ignorant you were because you couldn't answer the questions. And by the end of the day, I knew that this was a turning point. So I went to see their demonstration school. So they had the prescience. We have the knowledge of the past. We understand our times, I think. We're attempting to. We are ordinary people, but we must take a stand against deception. And that's what this is all about. And that was their hope and their prayer. And so we have this little 3-part plan to stop America's decline and restore our biblical heritage. This is based upon a plan developed 3 years ago, which is part of the reason you're all here today, and Carrie's going to explain the plan to you.